All right, so today we're diving into a pretty fascinating case. It revolves around Mahmoud Khalil. He's a recent Columbia University grad and a Palestinian activist who's now facing deportation. And get this, he's actually a legal permanent resident, not even on a visa, which makes things even more interesting. We're going to try to unpack why this is blown up into such a big controversy, especially how it all ties back to free speech, campus activism, and Trump-era immigration policies. We've got a whole bunch of sources here, news articles, legal analyses, even some reactions from Columbia University itself. We're going to break it all down for you.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those situations where the law gets super murky and the stakes are unbelievably high. Not just for Khalil himself, but potentially for any permanent resident who's engaged in political activism.
For sure. So let's start with the basics, like who, what, and when. Mahmoud Khalil has been a very vocal presence in those pro-Palestinian demonstrations at Columbia. He was really involved in those protest encampments back in 2024, even acted as a student negotiator during those events, his main goal, pushing the university to divest from companies that do business with Israel. Then just this past weekend, things took a huge turn. ICE agents showed up at his university-owned apartment. Initially, they told him they were there about a student visa, but that was a mistake. Khalil's lawyer was quick to point out that he's a green card holder, not here on a visa, but that didn't stop ICE. They announced their intent to revoke his green card, and then they ended up transferring him to a detention center in Louisiana. That's over 1,000 miles away from his home, his support system. And crucially, his wife, who's currently pregnant.
Yeah, that choice of location, it's actually a tactic we see a lot in immigration detention. It's basically a way to make it as difficult as possible for detainees to get legal representation, to stay connected with their families, or even build a support network outside. Essentially, it's a way to isolate them when they're at their most vulnerable.
Yeah, it really just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing, doesn't it? We also have to remember what Khalil's lawyer, Amy Greer, told NPR. She said that ICE agents literally hung up on her when she asked for a warrant. So it really begs the question, what are they even accusing Khalil of? According to our sources, it all stems from his alleged support of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which the U.S. designates as terrorist organizations, obviously. Some reports claim his group, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, actually voiced support for leaders of these organizations. But the million-dollar question is, can simply expressing support for these groups be enough to deport a legal permanent resident?
Well, that's where President Trump's executive order from 2024 comes in. It was specifically aimed at combating anti-Semitism on campuses, and it allows for deportation based on something the order calls endorsing or espousing terrorist activity. The order itself cites a law already on the books that allows for this kind of action. So this case really hinges on how the courts choose to interpret this executive order and how broadly they define endorsing or espousing.
So you're saying it raises the question of whether expressing support, even verbally, for a group like Hamas, could be enough to trigger this executive order.
Precisely. And that's why legal experts are glued to this case. It could set a precedent that goes way beyond just student activism. It could impact any green card holder who engages in political speech that the government considers problematic. You have to think about all those nuanced situations where someone might express an opinion that happens to align with a designated terrorist organization, even if they don't condone any of the organization's violent actions. Would that be enough to trigger deportation? This case might very well provide those answers.
It's pretty unsettling to think about how broadly this could be applied.
Right. And we also have to consider the specific legal details here. On the one hand, we have the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech, even if that speech might be offensive to some people. But then on the other hand, we've got these immigration laws that give the government a lot of power to deport non-citizens, even those with green cards, under certain conditions, of course. So this case is likely going to come down to how those two areas of law intersect and clash.
So we're dealing with a real clash of fundamental American values here.
Yeah.
And it's not just theoretical either. There's a real human cost to all of this. And Columbia University itself has been pulled into the center of this whole storm.
Absolutely. And the university's initial response, or rather lack thereof, actually adds another layer to this whole story. Initially, Columbia University just stayed silent, about Khalil's arrest, and it really sparked outrage among students and faculty.
It's interesting how that silence almost seemed to galvanize the Columbia community.
Oh, it definitely did. There have been protests popping up outside Columbia and at ICE offices in Manhattan. There's this petition going around calling for Khalil's release, and it's already gotten over 900,000 signatures. Faculty members are joining up with Jewish community leaders and immigrant rights advocates. They're issuing all these statements denouncing the arrest as unconstitutional. It's become a huge rallying point.
And it seems like this situation with Khalil has uncovered other incidents, too. Our sources indicate that ICE agents tried to detain another international student at Columbia that same weekend.
Right, but in that case, they showed up at her apartment without a warrant and they were turned away. That little detail really makes you wonder how common these tactics are. Makes you think how many other students might be facing this kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, it definitely feeds into that fear of a chilling effect that you mentioned before.
Exactly. Imagine you're an international student at Columbia right now. Would you feel comfortable participating in a debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Would you feel okay signing a petition or joining a protest, knowing that your visa or even your green card could be on the line?
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would create an environment where students might just self-censor out of fear.
Precisely. And that fear can be especially strong for students who are already marginalized or vulnerable, you know? They might be way more hesitant to speak out or participate in any kind of activism just because the potential consequences for them are so much higher.
We even have this quote here from Sophie Elman Golan. She's the communications director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And she calls targeting a permanent resident like this an aberration.
It's pretty significant that even within Jewish communities, there's a lot of concern about this case and what it means for due process and free speech in general.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unease about how this could impact other marginalized groups as well.
Yeah, it raises concerns about whether this could set a precedent, you know, for targeting people based on their political affiliations or even just their opinions. It's a slippery slope that we need to be really careful about.
It's interesting to think about the timing of all this as well. Khalil's arrest happened just a few days after the Trump administration pulled $400 million in funding from Columbia. They claimed that the university wasn't doing enough to control anti-Semitism on campus.
Right, and critics see that as a direct attempt to punish the university for allowing these protests to happen in the first place. Makes you wonder if Khalil's arrest is just another form of punishment, you know, making an example out of him to scare other students into silence.
Yeah, that raises some serious questions about the real motivation behind all this. Is it really about fighting anti-Semitism? Or is it more about silencing dissenting voices and controlling the narrative?
It's a tactic we've seen before in other situations. You know, silencing dissent by just labeling it as anti-American or unpatriotic. It's a way to shut down conversations and create a climate of fear.
And we can't forget about the very real human impact of all of this. While these legal battles are being fought, Khalil is stuck in a detention center far from home, and his wife, who's 8 months pregnant. That separation and the uncertainty of their future, it must be incredibly stressful.
It really is. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these policies and the toll they take on individuals and families.
This whole situation really highlights how closely intertwined free speech, student activism, and immigration have become, especially under the Trump administration.
Absolutely. It's a complex intersection with really far-reaching consequences, not just for the people directly involved, but for the very fabric of our society.
It makes you ask those tough questions. Where do we draw the line between protecting national security and upholding individual rights? Can we really justify deporting someone, especially a legal permanent resident, just for expressing their political views, even if those views are seen as controversial or offensive?
Yeah, these are questions we as a society really need to grapple with, and the answers will have huge implications for the future of free speech and dissent in America.
Yeah, it really feels like we're watching all these different rights and values collide, and it's all happening right on college campuses.
That's a really good way to put it. There's this tension, you know, between free speech and academic freedom, and the government trying to control what it sees as threats to national security, or in this case, anti-Semitism. And then you have universities stuck right in the middle, trying to figure out how to navigate all these conflicting pressures.
And you mentioned earlier that this is all happening against the backdrop of, you know, these rising tensions surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. This case isn't happening in some kind of bubble. These debates are playing out on campuses all over the country, with protests, demonstrations, and unfortunately, sometimes even incidents of harassment or even intimidation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how universities can even find that balance between, you know, encouraging open dialogue and also ensuring that all their students are safe and feel supported, especially in such a highly charged environment.
It's definitely a challenge. Universities are supposed to be places where ideas can be freely exchanged and debated, even when those ideas are controversial or make people uncomfortable. But at the same time, they have this responsibility to protect their students from harm and create an environment where everyone feels safe to express themselves without fear.
It's like walking a tightrope. And this case with Khalil just adds another layer of complexity to it all.
Oh, for sure. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out legally. His lawyers are probably going to argue that his arrest and detention violate his First Amendment rights. They'll likely point out that he hasn't even been charged with a crime, and that as a green card holder, he's entitled to due process.
It makes you think about what could happen if the courts were to side with the government.
Oh, it would be a huge setback for free speech and immigrant rights. It would send this chilling message to other permanent residents. You know that their status is basically conditional, and that it could be taken away just for expressing their political opinions.
Almost like it would create this hierarchy of citizenship.
Yeah.
Where permanent residents have fewer rights and protections than natural-born citizens.
Exactly. And it could also embolden the government to start targeting other groups, based solely on their political beliefs or affiliations. It could lead to this whole climate of fear and self-censorship.
It brings us back to those big questions we were talking about earlier. Where do we draw that line? What are the limits of free speech, especially when it comes to non-citizens? And what kind of society do we really want to live in? One where dissent is stifled and people are too afraid to speak their minds.
These are questions we all need to be asking ourselves right now. This case has really brought them to the forefront, and it's going to force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our values and priorities as a nation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think this case really shows how fragile our rights actually are, and how important it is to stay vigilant. We can't just assume our freedoms will always be there. We need to be aware of what's going on around us, and be willing to speak out when we see injustice happening.
It's also a reminder that these issues are complex.
There are rarely any easy answers, and it's so important to consider different perspectives and have those difficult conversations even when we disagree with each other. I think this case is a really stark reminder that what happens to one person can have ripple effects for so many others. What happens to Mahmoud Khalil will definitely set a precedent that impacts countless other lives. It underscores the importance of being engaged citizens, staying informed, and holding our leaders accountable for their actions.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you, our listener. This case is still unfolding, and it's vital that we all stay informed and keep having these important discussions. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.